The Creality Ender 3. Is it the new standard in budget 3D printers? I'll tell you what's to like and what to watch out for. Creality have followed up on the huge success of their CR10 with the Ender 2, but more significantly, now the Ender 3. At only US $200, it offers a lot for the money. Let me take you through some of the features. It has a large 220 squared by 250mm high build volume. It's made from solid V-slot extruded aluminium frame. It's got a Bowden extruder, and it also has a heated bed, opening up your range of materials. So there's a lot of hype around this printer, and most reviews have been quite favourable. So we're going to look at my experience, and to do that we're going to rewind to when I unboxed it, assembled it, and did the first test prints. Here we are, ready for assembly, and this is going to be a bit of a mystery. Some sources seem to say this takes 2 to 4 hours, and then on their website it says it has knockdown construction and it's only going to be about 10 minutes. Only way to find is to check out what's inside the box, so let's pull out all the pieces and see what we got. Well, this looks promising. There are some large pre-assembled bits, none bigger than this bed and wire assembly. That means we're not going to have to assemble every tiny little thing, but I still think there's a little bit of work that needs to be done. Let's have a look what we've got here. We've got the bed, we've got our main extrusions, we've got a sub-assembly for probably the X and our extruder stepper motor. We've got the LCD front panel. We've got some end stop, sample filament, Bowden tube parts, scraper, instructions, power supply with a nice injection molded safety cover, mystery cylinder, I assume some sort of heat guard, another stepper motor, another carriage, and the final bag has belts, cable ties, Allen keys, tools, things of that nature, and a guarantee. All right, instructions. I'm a valued customer, good to know. And then our instructions for assembly are actually extremely short. This open into a poster. Yes, it does. So we have list 1 and 2 with all of the parts, and then we have step 1 to 4 on the first page through to step 12 on the second page. So maybe this is going to be quite fast. Anyway, let's not guess, let's find out exactly how long it's going to take. I'm going to turn off that light, turn on my timer, and start the time lapse and see how quickly I can get this thing together. Assembly is finished, and I have to say that was a very pleasant experience. Only 12 steps is probably indicative of how foolproof and easy this thing was to put together. The only thing that's been quicker than this lately was the Cocoon Create Touch, also known as a 1-How Duplicator i3 Plus. Most of the sub-assemblies needed very little work, and a lot of the time when you pulled something out of the bag, it already had the little T-slot nuts and bolts in place, so all we had to do was slide them in and tighten them. This mystery object on top was the spool holder, should have worked that out. There are spares for everything, so there's at least 1 or 2 of every bolt left. There are some tools, which I couldn't see at the start, a set of side cutters, a bunch of cable ties. I might tidy up this wiring just a little bit, but there's not too much to tidy up. As I plugged in the wiring, everything was labeled really nicely, so that was straightforward too. I will note the power supply can take 220 or 110 volts, and you're meant to switch it before you put it in, so don't miss that step. I've organized the plug that I need with the Australian PowerPoint pattern, and it's just got the standard 3-pin plug, so you should be covered for anywhere in the world. That was definitely a good experience. It was much shorter than something like the Mark III, much shorter than something like the Tronxy X1, and really quite hard to go wrong, I would say. I was quite impressed. All of the tools were sufficient. I didn't need to use any of my own. The spares, everything's really well labeled. Pretty much have no complaints about that. Now, looking at this frame on paper, it seems fairly rigid. It's got some nice touches like these little plastic pieces on the end that say Creality 3D on them. Doesn't seem to have any wobble back and forth. This LCD screen is mounted at a nice angle. My only concern is that for the Z axis there's only one stepper motor and it's only on one side. So I've been trying to turn this by hand to see if the side with the lead screw is actually moving a little bit more than this side, which is passive. Time will tell in the quality of the prints. Apart from that, there doesn't seem to be really any wobble or give at all. I'd say the rubber wheels are really well sized for the extrusion, just right on the V slot, and that makes a huge difference. So I've put the SD card in, I've got some filament loaded up on top. So I'm going to heat up the nozzle and the bed, and then I'm going to level it and start the dog test print. Now, one thing I love about this type of Bowden extruder setup is you don't need to use any of the electronic menus to load and remove filament. You just got to bring it up to temp, and then you can manually squeeze the trigger, and that releases the stepper motor. Then you just squeeze it through manually, and you should see it coming out the nozzle underneath. Let's start this print on the SD card. Well, here we are the next morning, and oh dear. Clearly this has not adhered to the bed and it's come loose partway through, and we have a big bunch of spaghetti. Now this test file, even though it failed, was going for 5.5 hours. I've examined the G-code and it's got a very slow printing speed and 0.15 layer height. So not ideal if you're impatient and anxiously want to get your first 3D print out. It's definitely way too big to be used with the test filament, so don't fall into that trap. But the main thing I would like to address is the fact that it didn't have the heated bed turned on. I know some people print with PLA without a heated bed, but generally I do it at 60 degrees. So what I've done is found the exact same model on Thingiverse. I'm going to slice it myself with slightly faster speeds and with the bed turned on, and hopefully we can get a much better and faster result. So we have our finished puppy. It's pretty good. Main problem is some stringing because I forgot when I copied my profile for the Cocoon Create Touch that this is a Bowden extruder, and therefore the retract settings were nowhere near enough. But apart from that, there's nothing to really fault from what the printer's actually done. This is at 0.2 layer height versus 0.15 for the original test file, and the quality on both of them is quite good. It stuck almost too well. I didn't adjust anything since the one that fell off. It's just from it heating up, which does two things. One, it helps the PLA adhere. Two, it expands and comes a little bit closer to the nozzle. So a slight adjustment on the wheel to lower it just the tiniest little bit. I think it's dialed in well enough to do a whole bunch of printing, and after I've done that, I'll report back. So here we are a few weeks later, and I have been very busy using this machine. I've tried to make it my go-to for most of my printing jobs, and I've put it through its paces with a range of different prints in different styles and different materials. Let me talk you through them. After getting Nico the puppy working, the next thing I decided to do was to test for accuracy. So to do that, I printed my two-part Teaching Tech Maker coin. So this one turned out pretty good. It's not quite as good a fit as my Prusa Mark III, but it's pretty nice. It went together first go, and it makes that satisfying click. The two halves are very close to meeting and being perfectly flush. They're not quite there, but it was pretty accurate and I was definitely impressed. That one was in PLA, so I decided to try out some ABS. I printed this series of tiny figurines that my students had designed in Mesh Mixer. Now, I had heard mixed reports about the performance of the heated bed in this, and I was pleased to say that mine heated up to 100 degrees and then the nozzle as well, all inside 10 minutes, and this was in a cold winter's room. What wasn't so good, however, is that when I heated up to 100 degrees for the first time, the BuildTak style sheet on top of the build platform actually delaminated. Now, I've never seen anything like this before, and I wasn't in the room at the time. I came in a few minutes after the print had started, and everything had peeled up on the corners, and then the nozzle came and put this gash in it as it tried to start the print from the homing position, causing the damage that you see here. Now, I did some searching and I haven't found a single other person who shared this experience, so I'm willing to chalk that down to an anomaly. I did smooth it back down, it has stayed there, so if you get this printer, just make sure you're around the first time you heat it up and make sure everything is stuck down. So I switched back to PLA, and this is another student work, this time an artwork. It's a bit of a torture test for a Bowden style setup because it requires a lot of retraction. I didn't have the settings too high at that stage, so there is a little bit of stringing, but the shape was nicely formed, seems pretty strong. This one took a little under a day, and I was happy with the reliability of the printer because it got it done first go. Feeling confident, I took on a torture test from one of the 3D printer groups that I'm in, and this is the House of Cards. Unfortunately, this one didn't quite get there. What I probably should have done is slowed down the speeds because all the wobble introduced as it got taller and taller caused some banding and then a slight failure at the end. But considering this profile was pretty much untweaked, it got a lot further than some of the other ones posted up in the torture challenge thread. So far I'd been impressed with the accuracy of this printer, so I thought I would really step it up and do some chainmail. Now when I did this on my Mark III as a test, it worked first go and it printed really well and it's quite mesmerizing. This one's not quite as good. Yes, it does articulate and turn back on itself, but I had a lot of trouble dialing in the retraction. If you think about it, there's so many individual little pieces that are built up on this, so there's going to be a lot of retraction, and how I had the slicer settings at the start was retracting so much that the end filament was listed as a negative number, and halfway through the print it failed for that reason. It had retracted so much compared to what it was extruding that the filament unwound and was hanging out unattached to the printer. So I had to adjust that a few times. The result is some sparse extrusion, but enough there to hold it together, and after loosening up all of the parts, it does in fact work, so pretty good result. I printed this Panther to see how the printer would handle organic shapes as well as putting in a lot of support material, and it did really well for both of those. It's got a really nice sheen at 0.2 layer height as you move it around underneath the light, and I think most people will be happy with this print. Of course, it's got a little bit of cleanup on the underside where the support was, but that's the same for any 3D printer. What 3D printer review would be complete without the 3D Benchy? I did a couple in different colors of PLA and I was pretty happy with those. Simplify 3D put in a few surface zits on the layer changes, so I'd need to dial in the settings a little bit there. There's some minor surface artifacts, but nothing really significant. The cooling worked well on the overhangs, and overall I'd have to say these are pretty nice prints. It was now time for a long print, and coming in at just under 2 days printing time was this Pod Walker. Now this one gave me a little bit of trouble. I tried to print the version where everything was on the plate at the same time. The first time I came back to see the print a couple of hours in and there was a layer shift and that print had to be cancelled. Second time I ran the print, I noticed that some things had come loose partway through, but I let the print continue because the biggest parts were going quite well, and then it took me a third go. For the third print, I loaded up the parts that had failed and I completely butchered this. I got impatient and tried to separate one of the low-lying ones that had finished, accidentally knocked off one of the higher ones, decided to test the power pack. So I unplugged the printer, I wrapped everything in masking tape, turned it back on. To the printer's credit, it did go back to the original position and continue printing, but the damage had already been done. I couldn't recover from the print being slightly out of position. I had to stop it and do a fourth print to get the final couple of parts. I reckon this is a pretty cool model. Everything fitted together really nicely on this, and generally the surface finish is pretty attractive overall. Those failed prints with all the bits of filament going everywhere really pointed out the need for a modification. So I took the Thingiverse and I found this fan cover. There's definitely a design flaw on this machine, that the fan cover for the electronics sits just underneath the bed and just underneath the home spot for the extruder, where plastic is likely to be oozing out and potentially falling inside, stopping the fan and damaging your system. So I would highly recommend printing this mod or a similar one to avoid that from happening. This print was the only one I did with the Cura profile provided on the SD card, and there was only two problems with that as far as I was concerned. One, it was set to only 45 degrees instead of 60 degrees for the bed, so it didn't stick as well as some of the other prints. And two, I don't think the default profile should be 1.5 layer height. I think 0.2 is sufficient for most people's needs. Finally, I decided to try out some flexibles. A Bowden extruder can potentially make this tricky because you've got a lot more friction as it passes. This one has an extruder which has a little section there to catch it, and fortunately it printed quite well. All I changed on my profile was putting the temperature up to 240 degrees, the bed temperature to 0, and the print speed to 30 millimeters per second. So that was what I printed. I hope you agree it's a nice wide range of different style prints, and now I'd like to do my summary in terms of pros and cons. Firstly, the pros. This printer is quite stiff and quite sturdy compared to my other two printers in the room. There's very little wobble from the gantry up the top, and this feels the most portable. I have no problem lifting this up, I think this printer with its compact size versus its large build volume would be pretty ideal to transport around with you in a car. I think it's going to stand up to that really well. And that build volume is quite significant for a printer of this footprint overall. I have to say, for a budget printer and compared to a lot of printers, really the print quality on this is quite good. I think for 90% of the prints that people do on 3D printers, this is going to be quite capable and churn out a good print with a minimum of fuss. I would argue that this printer is quite versatile. PLA, of course, it has no problem with. It is an open frame design, so large ABS things are going to struggle, but at least the bed heats up quite quickly. And as you saw, it can print TPU quite effectively without slowing down the print speed too much. Now, in my opinion, one of the standout features of this printer, particularly for the price point, was the ease of assembly. It took way less time than other printers that I've put together. It was pretty foolproof, the instructions were good, and there's a backup of all the documentation on the SD card. I think the features on this thing are pretty good out of the box. It doesn't have anything as sophisticated as auto bed leveling, although I will note that these oversized adjustment wheels are really nice to use, but it does come with a part cooling fan, and it even has power panic, which I tested and did in fact work. My last pro for this printer is the fact that it's already quite popular. So that means two things. There's a lot of community support on Facebook groups and forums, and it also means on Thingiverse and other places there's a lot of ready to print mods so you can tweak and improve your printer. So let's move on to the cons, and there are a couple. Firstly, the build surface. Now, I did experience that very strange delamination of the stickered sheet on top. It sticks pretty well. It's a rip-off of BuildTak, but I would recommend, if you have this printer, ordering a spare sheet of your favorite one and having it ready to go. As I already mentioned, there is a design flaw with the positioning of the fan, so printing this duct would be a must unless you want your printer to break down. And there also remains question marks over the design of the Z-axis. There's only one stepper motor on one side, and I found when I was first setting it up that it was binding as I tried to move it up and down. And to get around that, it tells you in the manual to loosen two of the screws around the lead screw. That got rid of the problem for me, but you are introducing a little bit of slop. There are some mods I've seen to try and address this problem, however. Now, I think it would be foolish to say the Bowden extruder this comes with is a design flaw, because printers like the CR10 and the Anycubic Mega are quite popular with them. I do think it's fair to say that they are trickier to dial in. You'll be up and printing straight away with this, but to tweak the absolute best quality, you're going to need more tinkering than a machine that doesn't have that setup. Now, this next one comes down to personal preference, but I think it's hard to argue that it's a good decision, and that is having a micro SD slot instead of a normal size SD slot. They're quite tiny and fiddly. Depending on where you've got the printer, it can be hard to access it and get it out. What I've been doing to get around this problem is using one of these adapters that plugs in, and then you use a full-size SD. It looks a little bit unsightly, but it's much more convenient. Now, this last one is also going to come down to personal preference, and that's the fact that Creality has not released any type of firmware for this. If you go to their website, it's got a download for the CR10S, but there's nothing for this. Fortunately, there is community firmware available, which I'll link in the description, and you're going to need it if you want to add things like automatic bed leveling. For most people, they want to stick with the factory stuff, but that means they'll be limited into only doing mods that are on the physical frame of the machine, and nothing more complicated than that. Now, summing up, on balance, I think there is a reason this printer has got such good reviews. Now, I've seen that Angus from Maker's Muse is having a nightmarish time with him, and I have to say that I think his is cursed. It would seem to me like he got a pre-production unit. For instance, it's got a 3D printed power supply cover, whereas all the other ones I've seen in the wild have an injection molded one. So potentially he's got one that hasn't passed the same quality control as the ones that you and I can buy. And that means that all the bugs haven't been ironed out, and it's not really indicative of the typical experience that you would get from buying this printer. Now, of course, any 3D printer is going to need a degree of tinkering and troubleshooting, but I would argue that this one was quite good out of the box and proves to be a very solid base. So let's compare it with its competitors. We have the ANET A8, which for a long time has been the champion of the people for a budget printer. Now, there's a lot of people who are very happy with that printer, but you should acknowledge that it does need some mods, particularly for safety. For instance, covering the exposed mains wiring for the power supply. This machine is still more expensive, but I would argue it's got a bigger build volume and it's more capable out of the box and probably a nicer experience. I think this printer, for its quality versus price, is going to be a future favorite. If you've already bought one, please leave a comment below. How was your experience? Are you happy with it? Have you had any quality control issues? As for me, I love to tinker with 3D printers, so I'm going to check out the mods available in the community, print a little bit more and see if there's any I want to develop myself, so you can look out for that in a future video. Thanks for watching. and happy 3D printing.
G'day, it's Michael again. If you liked the video, then please click like. If you want to see more content like this in future, click subscribe and make sure you click on the bell to receive every notification. If you really want to support the channel and see exclusive content, become a patron. Visit my Patreon page. See you next time.